I thought it might be nice if you wouldn't mind starting with a little reading. If you could read the prologue, would you want to do that?
Sure, absolutely. I'd be happy to. First of all, just thank you everybody for coming. This is so wonderful. And before I get started, just a quick early pitch for Small World by Laura Zigman, which is a spectacular book. I know it's all about me, but come on.
This is what happens.
Okay, just saying. Sure, okay, I'll start with the prologue, and I'm not going to really introduce it because it's a prologue. So if I have to introduce it, I did it wrong. It begins here, in the city of Sarajevo, Bosnia, on a bitter November day in 1993. A city where minarets and steeples once shared the skyline, where men drinking cardamom-scented coffee from brass cups argued and sang into the night. In 1984, Olympic athletes skied down the slopes of Mount Igman to the cheers of the world. Only 9 years later, the abandoned bobsled track overflows with stockpiles of Serbian artillery. The mosques are rubble. Petals of collapsed concrete, blown apart by shell after shell, pock the streets. Gaping wounds that will be filled with scarlet resin when the bombings end. Sarajevo roses, they will call them, to commemorate the dead. A nondescript gray cinder block apartment complex looms over the bombed-out buildings on the west side of the Malakia River. Imagine yourself there, picking your way across the debris to building number 4, carefully, slowly, while sirens wail around you. When you're close enough to touch the walls, wipe a circle in the dust that covers the ground floor window on the left. Look inside. At first, you won't see any signs of life, but don't turn away. Look closer. In the back corner of a darkened room, a 3-year-old girl lies on the dirty floor under a cot. She stares at a diamond pattern of rusted bed springs over her head. Tufts of ticking from rips in the mattress hover over her like the clouds above the hills that ring the city. The scent of cabbage and garlic rises from the pot that's been simmering on the hot plate for hours. Her 6-year-old brother huddles against her, pressing his sweaty hands over her ears to dull the sound of exploding concrete. "Close your eyes," he says, but she's too frightened. Without shifting, she moves her head as much as she can until she sees the wedge of floor beneath the kitchen counter. Shards of glass and piles of concrete on green tile. Dust motes swirl in a gash of daylight streaming from a new hole in the front wall. The round yellow rug, covered in soot, her stick horse crosswise atop it, one glazed button eye, peering out from a pile of shattered brick. And, from the corner of her field of vision, a pale hand, motionless amid the debris. A hand whose wrist sports the brown sleeve of her mother's dress. The dress the girl helped fold that very morning, warm and sun-sweet from the clothesline in the back. A giant boot steps between the girl and the hand, then more boots. 2 male voices whisper. It's not a language she's used to hearing in their home. Her brother covers her mouth now instead of her ears. Keep quiet, keep still, his gestures tell her. He's always trying to shush her. She wrests herself away. The whispering stops. Suddenly a man's head appears. Blonde hair and beard, smears of dirt across his face, startling blue eyes. "Shit," he says. The girl recognizes this word. She's heard men shouting it from the trucks that rumble back and forth from the street outside their apartment. It's a word about things you don't want. Another man, who looks like the first one but with no beard, appears. His eyes are kinder. The bearded man's thick hands slide under the cot toward her. His fingernails are split and caked with grime. Her brother pulls her back toward the wall, trying as hard as he can to make them both disappear. The girl feels the man's hands grab her ankles. She tightens her grip on her brother's narrow shoulders. She'll be ripped in two, she thinks. Then another blast screams from outside. The apartment tilts again. The girl shuts her eyes and the world closes in. She lets go. Stop there.
It's a great opening and a great reading. You have said that you're influences are like, as a writer, it's like fly paper. I love this, and I'm sort of stealing your
my
say.
quote.
I'm
Okay, good.
stealing your
Yeah.
quote, but
This is what writers
that-
do, ladies and gentlemen, and people of the corner.
I love this because you said it, that ideas have come to you and stuck to you like as if on fly paper. And
Sure.
2 things. One is I'd love you to tell us why Sarajevo, and then after that, I'll ask you about Antigone.
Great. Well, I love talking about the Sarajevo piece audiences, but this is a really special one because the person I was in Sarajevo with, one of the people is here in this audience tonight. So the first time I ever left the United States was in 1987, and I was a sophomore in college, and I had very naive ideas about the world because I had never seen it. But when I started college, I discovered an incredible singing group called the Yale Slavic Chorus. I fell in love with the music. I fell in love with the sounds. I fell in love with the cadence of it. I just, I was head over heels. I have no Slavic origin myself, but it just felt like, yeah, this is amazing. So in 1987, of course, this was before the wall came down. This was a really long time ago. The Slavic Chorus traveled to what was then Yugoslavia. One of my friends who was in the Slavic Chorus with me, Megan High, was there. Sarajevo was the first city we woke up in, basically, and as I described it in the book, it felt to me like this interfaith paradise. There were mosques, there were synagogues, and there were churches, all everywhere, and the square felt like that sense of people communing and talking, and in my 19-year-old way, I thought, it's great, it's possible, I'm going to carry this with me. And then, just 3 years later, of course, you have everything that happened with the Balkan War, and then you have the Bosnian genocide, which was just heartbreaking for all reasons. But it cut me close in that way that things that you experience as a young person that shatter your illusions cut you close. And there's part of me, I think, that has been working and working and working that idea over in my head in a million ways. Another reason talking about this here in Brookline is really important is because I used to work for Facing History and Ourselves, and many of my other former colleagues are here with me. So everybody knows what that feels like, that sort of drive to understand and experience and sort of say, how can I use these feelings of confusion about the world to not only teach myself, but maybe use it to help other people learn and experience things as well. Yeah.
So interesting.
And now I played with it in a novel, so it is like fly paper. I mean, I keep coming back to these concepts and ideas in all of these ways. Yeah.
And then with Antigone too, how did that first stick to you?
Yeah. Honestly, the first time, so I don't know if people know or remember the basic plot line of Antigone. I'll say it really quickly. So, Greek tragedy, Sophocles. Antigone is a young woman. She happens to be Oedipus's daughter. That's a whole other story. We don't have to talk about that right now. But it's true. Or is it? Anyway, Antigone, in the beginning of the play Antigone, her uncle, Creon, has become the king of Thebes. And there was a bitter war to get there. She had 2 brothers, and they fought on opposite sides of the war, and they killed each other in the war. So Creon, who is now the king, decries that the brother fighting on his side, which is the side of the state, shall be buried in an appropriate manner, and the other brother will be left unburied, which is, as we say, a shanda. It's not okay. The gods will not be pleased with this, and so Antigone is the sister of both brothers and says, I can't let this stand. Even though this is the law of the state, I have to think about what we would call now morals and ethics, what they would talk about the laws of the gods as opposed to the laws of the state. And in defiance of the king, she buries her other brother. So the first experience of Antigone I had wasn't actually seeing Antigone as a play, but it was actually like a reboot of Antigone as a dance performance by this incredible choreographer named Annie B. Parsons. And it was kind of wild, and it was set in sort of like a disco, and like there were a lot of great things happening. And so I was already like, wow, Antigone, disco, I get it, right? I wouldn't say this is really a disco novel, but it's really fun to read. I mean, despite the fact that it's got this really, really tragic beginning. My character, Antonia King, is that little girl, but the main action of the novel starts many years later when she's just graduated from law school and she's starting a career in Minneapolis, and she's ready to basically take her version of the American dream by storm when she gets a call. in the middle of the night from that adopted uncle, who is the contractor who found her as a little girl and her brother, and says, your brother's gone missing. You have to come back to this small town and figure out what happens. And she says, okay, I gotta do it. And she is forced, over the course of time, to reckon with her own history, parts of which she could barely remember because her brother knew more than she did, and parts of which she can't really reconstruct herself because she was raised by, some well-meaning and some not well-meaning, but, a very common experience of parents and adopted parents saying, you're an American now, forget your troubled past, especially if they were not there. We're going to give you this great future, but we can only do this if you just leave that past behind. She learns that she can't do that. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard sometimes to talk about a novel like this, which is such a page-turner and also has this incredible family drama at its core. So we have to talk around so we don't give anything away. But the trauma, there's that aspect of family trauma and shared trauma and trauma many years later. And also the sense that here are these two siblings who, there's so many stories, in our own families. You're raised in the same family and you all have different versions of what your family was like. And they're almost like different people lived in your family. But, these two are very different, Antonio and Paul. And how did you come to develop their relationship and all that? So interesting.
Thanks. Well, I started with the character of Antonia. Once I got who is my Antigone stand-in and what's her, what drives her? What does she need to kind of like get through the day? And she has this incredible energy and drive to her as a character, but she also, in having that drive, has to push away things that are anxiety-provoking to her in any way, because she actually still has these nightmares. Paul has done the opposite, and that's, we can talk about like kind of writing techniques, but that's always a really good one. If like you can have one character who wants one thing and another character who wants exactly the opposite of what that character wants. And that sets you up as a writer for, some really juicy stuff. In life and families, it can make for some really like contentious.
A lot of psychotherapy.
Yeah, I know. It's really interesting. Big family meals, you're like, yeah. But in fiction, it's pretty awesome. Paul, her brother, is an activist, and he's rejected exactly what it is that the uncle has said to Antonia. And one of the things that he cares deeply about as somebody with a history as a refugee is inclusion in America and other refugee communities. And there is a Somali community that is starting to build a home in the present day in this town in Minnesota. It's a fictional town. I called it Thebes because, Greece. But it was really fun also creating this fictional town, but it was very much based on research and very much based on a sense that this could be a place and this could be happening. And in Minnesota, there was a huge community of Bosnian refugees that settled there. And then 30 years later, a huge community of Somali refugees. So there's some verisimilitude there. And Minnesota is a place where the laws are very favorable compared with a lot of other states in terms of employment and other such things. And so there's a really huge community of many, many different refugee communities coming into Minnesota. So it was a really interesting place to set the book. And I grew up in the Midwest before I moved to Connecticut, where then I went to high school, and I have a lot of friends from my high school days in Connecticut here too, which is great. But
where in the Midwest?
I lived in Michigan and Chicago. I was little, but people are little sometimes, and then they grow up.
Formative years.
It's amazing. Yeah.
You also do this really an interesting thing as far as when you're writing a novel. I've come to this conclusion now that I like to have a really short time frame, like 6 weeks, so I feel like I know the book is going to end.
Wait, you mean in the novel?
In the
or
novel,
not the writing?
No, not the actual writing of it, but
Okay.
it's
I was about to
in the book.
pass out.
Yeah.
Give
Oh,
yourself
no
6
problem.
weeks to write a novel.
6 weeks. That's actually long. But to give it a short time frame in the story, so I can sort of feel like, okay, it's going to be over soon. That's the whole thing. It's going to be over soon. It's going to be over soon. But you, it's 24 hours.
Yeah.
And it goes from afternoon to late afternoon to evening to dusk to night, I think, are the demarcations. But that's such an interesting. I mean, it's amazing. This is, Anne's first novel. I mean, you are a writer, and you've written lots of nonfiction, and we can talk about that in a minute. But this is your first novel, and I love, and it's no secret that she's 55 years old. So I love a good story like this, because it's amazing. Like, you've accomplished this great thing. It was an indie pick, which for March, which is when all the independent bookstores in the country, I don't know if all of them, but a select group of them, vote on the best books that they want to feature, and hers was a March pick. That's a really big deal. And the Strand chose it as their pick of, I mean, seriously, great stuff. And you did so much in this, and it's so hard to do this much and do it so well. And then you have this super compressed time frame, which why did you do that? It's so cool.
Well, thanks. Well, first of all, I cheated. I gave myself the summer solstice, which is the longest day of the year. So, if you're going to have one day, the sun does not go down. What I did in order to do similarly to what you said was, okay, I can do this. I can get it out there, is I picked a single day because one of the things that I was doing when I was writing this book is I actually took to the study of mysteries, and I studied mysteries and thrillers and how they were written. I did get an MFA in creative writing, 850,000 years ago, and it was all literary writing, which I love and adore, and where I feel myself most kind of situated naturally, but they never taught us anything about how would you want to plot a novel, or how would you want to plot a short story. That just, at least at the time when I was there, that was actually considered a kind of a lesser art form. I love it. I think plotting is fabulous, and the puzzle pieces that you kind of put together in order to do it, but I had to learn.
Yeah.
So I actually set myself that goal, saying, because one of the things that I learned from mystery writers is that the ticking clock is a huge tool, right, in keeping those pages turning. If you have a sense for the reader of, oh my gosh, we're running out of time, whatever that is. So it was actually a first draft move to try and get the first draft down on the page, and I was like, I'll fix it later if it stinks, right? How many times have we all said that? But what I did instead of changing it, because I ended up liking it, is creating then this other second timeline, which was the backstory, which took place over the course of 20 years. So I have the main story is in a single day, and then in alternating chapters we have the history of Tony and Paul growing up over time. So I gave myself that space, so it wasn't completely compressed.
And not that I want to know because I want to copy you, but how did you write each separate timeline separately, or did you do, when you were writing, were you alternating in the writing, going back and forth in time?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Neither, actually, so copy that. What I did was I wrote through the main timeline, and then as I found the spaces where I thought, okay, I have to figure out what happened in the past before I can move into what's going to happen in the present in my writing, I would write different sections. And then after I had a first draft, I found places where it felt too weak, too paltry, that I needed to beef it up more. I found other places where I was like, I think the order is wrong of these sections. I have to pull them out and put them back together again. And so it took several drafts before the final version in which the backstory happened when it happened and the main story happened when it happened. Now, I just read the prologue, which is not in the first person, but the main part of the book is all in the first person, and it's from the point of view of Antonia when she's 25.
So, some of us write, source material that's very autobiographical. That's what I do when I start something. It always starts, it sounds narcissistic to say, but it always starts with something that is very real to me or that's happened to me. Obviously, this is, not an autobiographical story for you, but was there a part, where are you in this character or in the story? Is there some piece of you that is in there?
Well, I'm the writer.
Yeah.
So I'm the puppet master,
I
guess. So there's a piece of me in every voice in the characters for sure. But I know what you're talking about. I know what you're saying. And in terms of story, autobiographical story, something that happens when you have a debut novel when you're 55 is I think you're maybe a little over that part. I started as a younger writer with thinly veiled autobiography in my first stories. And not to say there's anything wrong with that, it's beautiful if you can do that well, and I published a couple of short stories that were quite thinly autobiographical. At this point I had done enough fiction and sort of taken it out that I actually felt on solid ground with my skills as a researcher, A, because I really wanted to be good at that, and B, like a little bit outside of myself felt like the right distance. However, I will say it was very deliberate that I chose a 3-year-old child for Antonia to begin and to have the experiences that were formative for her and say this. And this is not, so this is something that I say at readings where my daughter isn't. She came to one and I was like, I'm not gonna tell that story. But you know, my daughter, her on her father's side, her father is a child of Holocaust survivors. And I am no longer married to her father. It's all very amicable in the past, so that's fine. But I saw her, and we divorced when she was 3. And so 3 is this point in my mind where I start to sort of hone in, I think, and look very deeply at what is it like to have a trauma when you're 3, right? What is a child's experience of that, and then what's a young woman's experience of that? And you know, there were multiple things that I saw her processing, but one of the things that I watched her processing from the perspective of, you know, a divorced mother is her family's history, and her grandparents are alive and were very much part of our lives. You know, she would, I'm laughing because I'm remembering a phone call that I got from preschool on the playground. The mother of another 4-year-old called me up and said, I have to tell you something about your daughter. I'm like, well, what? She's like, well, she was on the playground with my daughter, and she told my daughter that her great-grandparents were lined up in a ditch and shot. And I said, they were. I mean, so, you know, it's something that she was figuring out as a kid, and it's something that my main character has to figure out. It's a different trauma, it's a different era, but I hope, and I've heard that from readers, that the emotional experience feels like a very meaningful emotional experience, because that's, you know, what I have to write. That's what we have to write. You know, you have to find the character and hope that through telling something through their emotional journey, you can hook into something universal, maybe, hopefully, whatever the, you know, everybody's details are different, and every political situation is different, every, you know, situation in which there are crimes against humanity is different, but there are these universal emotions that, you know, we can hopefully work through.
That's so funny because in my novel, Small World, it's about 2 sisters, grown sisters that move in together as adults and finally deal with the loss of their other sister in childhood. And I was, you know, it's based a little bit on my personal story, but it's funny that you mentioned 3 because I was 3 when my sister died when she was 7. So that 3 year, even though I don't have any memory, real memory, it is the beginning of that sense of like, you're aware of something even if you don't have like really clear conscious memories, and you absorb stuff.
And I felt, honestly, also that I could authentically write this character as an American person, because I am also, even though I'm 4th generation, I am an American, born, bred, grown, thinking, feeling person, and I felt like 3 was the age at which I wouldn't have to, you know, have issue with not being Bosnian. And I did a lot of research, and in fact, one of the most powerful things I did was I actually spoke at great length with a young woman who was exactly Antonia's age when her family left Sarajevo. Found her through friends of friends and through an incredible place called the Post-Conflict Research Center in Bosnia that does fabulous work. I did a lot of research through there, but also spoke at length with this young person to try and understand and get through her, like, is this authentic? Will this resonate? And I felt, you know, that was very important.
Did you show it to her after?
I showed her pages of it, and she was good.
And you felt?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
I felt honored. I felt that, listen, I'm not speaking for anybody or people, and that wasn't the goal, but I didn't want to, you know, I didn't want to harm anybody, and I didn't want to get things wrong.
You want to
I'm
get it
sure
right
I got
as
things
right as
wrong.
possible.
And everything I got wrong is my fault. There's no question about that. So I just
Well,
did
I didn't
all the
see anything
research. Okay.
wrong.
But I didn't mean to go down that
No,
road too
I-
terribly.
so-
But
I
it's
think
important
so.
because,
So-
they're always in anything that you're putting out there in the world, right? You're thinking, I want this to mean something to the people that, would care about this. I did have, okay, this is a great experience just again for me, but it's a fun anecdote too. Let's just say nothing's probably going to come of this. However, I did get a call from an agent of a young director who said she was very interested in this and fell in love with the book and is, looking, she doesn't have any money, she's looking to get some money, but she wants to option. And she was born in Bosnia and is the same age as Antonia and found this story and has been doing films and documentaries about incredible things going back from her past. So, that did give my heart kind of a good feeling to say, all right, and I hope that she finds money. Let's all hope that she finds money, right? Because
Find
if
the
she
money.
finds the money, I will give that to her and it will be in the right hands, right? Like, so let's
Very
wish her gold and silver.
So, since we're pivoting to the business a little, talk about, again, you had many jobs, you wrote a lot, you edited anthologies, you wrote a lot of personal essay type stuff. So, talk a little bit about the difference, if there is any, for you in writing nonfiction and then fiction, and how long did it take to write this book, given your our complicated lives? Like
Yeah.
how did you do it?
Yeah, well, lives are complicated, right? So any passion projects have to be really, they just take the time that they take, for sure. Okay, those were like 5 questions.
You can start with, just tell us maybe just how long it took you. How did it develop?
Oh, this novel?
Yeah,
Okay,
this
so I
one,
started
yeah.
writing this mid 2018.
Okay.
Yeah, I started writing it mid 2018 because I had this job at this organization called Facing History in Ourselves, and how should I put this? It went away. Oh well. However, I loved that job very, very deeply, and it was all-consuming. Very, very, very involving. And I was the chief communications officer for this organization, and I loved it. And I was pouring my writing and my ideas into that. Plus, of course, 2 kids. So 2 things happened right at the same time in 2018, like actually within 2 days of each other. My job went somewhere, and then 2 days later, my kids said, first my kids accepted the colleges of their choice, and then 2 days later, my job went away. So I was like, uh-oh, and yay, both in a certain way. There was a lot of uh-oh. But then the yay part was the kids went to college. And when the kids went to college, I had to do other things to pay for the kids going to college. So I started my own business. And I was a communications consultant. But what that meant was I had my own hours. And I worked really, really hard, but I could work really, really hard on my own time, and my kids weren't there anymore. And that's when I was able to really let this project take root. So that was 2018. My hat is off to people who can work full-time and raise kids and have a very vibrant creative life at the same time. People do it. I know you've done it, and that's amazing. I wrote nonfiction when I had that set of circumstances going on. I wrote some short fiction, but I found during that time that it would take me at least a year to write a single short story. So I published maybe 2 short stories over the course of time when I was raising my kids and working full time. But nonfiction, I could do that. I could do some creative nonfiction, and I could edit anthologies of other essays, because that felt much more like, being like an orchestra conductor, right? And that was a different part of the brain, and I could do that and have jobs and raise my kids at the same time. But I just found fiction really, really hard with small children. I mean, part of the reason is if you're up in your imagination, your small children, they could die. I mean, they could fall off something while you're trying to imagine what a character is doing in some far off place 3,000 years ago. That would be bad.
Not ideal.
Not ideal. No.
Before we open it up to questions, because I'm sure there'll be many, talk a little bit about, there's this whole thing that you and I talk about a lot, which is the division between the art of writing and the business of publishing. And this is the thing that is just the most horrible thing that interferes in our creative lives, is the sense that, like, as you're working or as you're coming up with an idea or trying to finish the idea, there's always that thing in your head, like, is this going to sell? Is it saleable? Is it marketable? Blah, blah, blah. So what has this is your first novel, certainly not going to be your last, but how was this experience? Like, how did you find it?
The roller coaster on top of a cyclone. But also fabulous, because it's what I've wanted to do for so long. So there is that added benefit of having longed for something, and then you're like, okay, you got it, and I want that roller coaster. And it's fascinating and interesting, and luckily, the part about being an older debut novelist means that the 800 rejections that you get, I'm like, yeah, you know. When they used to come when I was younger, I would be, you know, completely devastated by them, and yet I kept going because, you know, stubborn and all that kind of stuff. But that part is easier as an older person, I will say. Now, that said, once this book went out on what they call, it goes out on submission, which is you have a literary agent and they say, okay, I think this is ready, and they send it to publishers, and then it's horrible. And for me, it was horrible through 22 rejections. But then I got my one yes. You know, some people's yeses come first. Mine, you know, this was just not a straightforward path. I think everybody gets that. But that's fantastic too, because here it is. And then I got the yes, and then I was like, okay, here we are, let's do this, this is great. And I love it, and I love this, and I love seeing people who are just so generous to come out and support, and from all aspects of my life, and being able to talk to you and talk about things that I care about so deeply. How fantastic is this? And if the book's journey is how that gets us to here, you know, fantastic. I love it.
I would just like to say that her attitude, very rare. Very, very, very rare. Most people, not happy, full of complaint, myself included sometimes. But that is, I think that's what makes this whole thing, your publication, our recent friendship, blah, 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 so incredible. Is like, I so admire the stories of people's lives that are not linear, that don't happen in a clean, straightforward way. Mine has been that way too. Yeah. I always find those people so much more interesting, and the fact that you know, came to this, you know, I mean, you got the MFA and you've been writing and all that, but then, you know, to have a first novel, and have such a great attitude about it, and it has done, you know, it has made that impact that not all first novels get to make. So I think it's been, just as an outsider, I'm like, look at the jacket, look at the blurbs, blah, blah, blah. And you happen to live in this sort of like red hot center of a part of New Jersey, Montclair, where all these publishing executives live and authors live. And so you've been like, it's almost like you've been in that world, ready to come out. I kind of like that all these big people live there, and it's just,
that's true.
So
I think it's interesting too. I mean, the way that we became friends was because of this process, and it's an interesting story as well. What Laura was just saying, part of what she does is she's a coach for writers, and because, you know, you've had such depth of experience from all sides in the publishing, all sides of the publishing world, as the writer, as the publishing side, the ups, the downs, you know, the wild highs and the lows. And you're such an empathic person and such a giving person, and the way that you give to other writers is by this kind of coaching process. And once I sold this novel, and I felt like, I'm really actually not sure what's going to happen next and what I should be focusing on in this process. And I heard through another fellow writer that Laura had this practice, and it's an unusual practice. You know, it's not editing per se, it's not that kind of writing. It's sort of like being like a therapist for writers going out in the world. And I could come to Laura and say, okay, this person called me, is that weird or is that good? You know, and you really helped me steer a course. Yeah.
I love doing it, and so I get to meet people like you.
Yeah.
So, on that note, why don't we open it up to some questions? There are questions. Otherwise, we can just keep gabbing. Yes.
So, when you were writing this, probably your mind is also drifting at times because you're so deep in it into another novel. So is that happened, and how fast did that happen? And what did you do with that idea about your next novel?
Okay. Yes. And this novel came about as a drift from another project. So you're exactly right. I was actually working on a nonfiction project, a memoir, and I was at a writer's colony called the Ragdale Foundation outside of Chicago, which was really great. And the idea for this project actually came from a friend of mine who said, somebody's approached me about doing a potential television pitch. Do you have anything in mind? Because we're writing partners. And I said, I've always wanted to do something about Antigone. And we were kind of tossing that around. And to make a long story short, we took that pretty far. And then we got a no at a pretty high level. But we had already agreed that because that had been my thought in the beginning, if one of us was to go back and ever write the novel, it would be me. So I just gave it a shot, and I was like, I'm gonna give myself 2 weeks on this other project that's a drift project, right? And I started writing it as a novel, and I just got hooked into this character, Antigone, and Antonia, and I just loved it, and I kept going. But yeah, I mean, I have like 8 or 9 other novels, right, that all come around. I'm very old-fashioned in my keeping of files, which means they're messy and they're handwritten. So I have index cards, that I always just sort of keep around me when I'm writing. And then I'll just, sometimes I don't remember what the note, it'll be like small people, cars, eat carrots. And then I'll be like, what was that idea? But I try to, do kind of margin notes on other things and then say, okay, go over here. But sometimes it does happen, right? That the novel you think you're writing ends up being the thing that you put to one side, and the drift ends up being the thing that takes you all the way there. Yeah. Sue?
So, reading the prologue, I can just see, I just visualize it, and it's so funny that you talk about the movie, because I'm like, this would be a great movie, because you see the landscape, and you see the little girl. Would you ever write the screenplay for it?
Well, I think that there are, sure. Yeah. Or I would put it in the hands of a very talented young Bosnian immigrant who is looking for money, so let's think gold for her. But I would love to be involved, obviously,
yeah, some
sure.
authors, in their novels, they're just like, this is a written form. I don't want to have anything to do with film, but I wasn't.
I love the back and forth. I love television. I love film. I love all of the different parts of it.
That's your theater background.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yes, as you well know.
Yeah.
Exactly. No, I do. I think it's fantastic, and I love the idea of dipping my hand in lots of different writing forms. It would be really interesting. I don't know the formal screenplay writings. It's very formal and very specific, but I would love to work with a really experienced person to do it. Alexia.
I'm interested in the research part, because you said you were super deliberate about wanting to get things right. What were some ahas, some sort of shocks, and then what was left on the cutting room floor? What didn't make it?
That's a great question. I'll repeat it. Alexia asked in the research process, what were the sort of ahas or shocks in the research process, and what was left on the cutting room floor? I mean, I can start with the second half. Almost everything was left on the cutting room floor. Because, I think in fiction, you can kill your story with all of the research. You have to be a really, really deft hand if you're going to be totally using immersing in historical fiction. There are people who do it brilliantly, but this is not historical fiction. I wanted to have so much research that I could kind of forget about it and then just write the character and make sure that I would then go back and look at my research and say, okay, did I stray from anything? Did I make an egregious error? I'll fix it, I'll course correct. But, it's a danger to include everything just because you learned about it, right?
That's so interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it can make it dead. I think we've all read just sort of snoozer novels that are just sort of like, oh. I mean, maybe only me. Maybe everybody else is a much better reader than I am, and I'm the only one who falls asleep and says, I don't know, is the new season of Yellow Jackets on yet? But let's see, in your first question, what really surprised me? I'm constantly being surprised. You know, when I was doing research into something I knew very little about, which was the experience of Somali refugees coming into Minnesota, and I read article after article and really spent a lot of time in sort of voices and places. And I think that I kind of was surprised at what ended up being pretty central in the book, which is not about the big city communities and the large communities, but about these really small towns across America. You know, I know in New Hampshire, it's very much like that, right? Where you have small towns and you have really small but really dedicated communities who really want to both, you know, integrate into the lives that they have chosen, or, you know, not chosen, but have, and figure out how to keep tradition too, and that it's not just about what we read mostly in the big papers, in the New York Times and the Washington Post about that, but you know, where there's maybe a community of 12 or 24 people, and yet it is a true community. And that was really important for me to learn about. Brian.
Hey.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Brian from Worcester. You know, in life, in our relationship, I experience you as so generous and giving and lovely, and your novel makes me so edgy. As I read it. The suspense is amazing. I'm like, what's happening next? So that.
Wait, does that mean I'm withholding? What does that
No.
mean?
Like I don't know.
Okay, I like that. Just teasing you. It's
I
okay.
love that you brought up the age 3 thing.
Mhm.
I think it's for me it's very interesting because you know, age 3 is this time when children move from parallel play to playing together, right? It's this moment of transition that happens then, and if that is the moment when the trauma happens, and trauma, of course, is something that cleaves, right? And so we have something that is cleaving in the moment of transition to connect. I think that's really interesting. And as I sort of wander through the book and listen to you both so beautifully talk about it tonight, I wonder what you have discovered in the writing of it about healing, and I think about love.
Maybe you should be. Great question.
He's good. He's very good. Trust me. Yeah. That is a beautiful question. What have I discovered about healing and about love? You know, on the flip side of learning about, you know, trauma. Again, through a fictional universe, which is very specifically what it is, but in a way, how can I explain it? How does my mind want to say this? I love fiction, and I'm drawn to it as an art form because it is kind of a closed universe. You know, I mean, your book is called Small World. It has many resonances, but I just thought of that in one way because one has to create a small world, and it has to have bounds. And so within the bounds, in the writing and the rewriting and the understanding of the character and trying to get truer and truer as you rewrite dialogue and rewrite monologue and try to think, what is the real emotional arc of this character? Because at least for me, that didn't come until maybe draft 15 or 16. You know, I worked it and worked it and worked, and I didn't understand it myself. What is the emotional development of this character? And it did turn out in this closed universe that everybody had to find their own version of what love means as a character. Yeah. Again, I'm not going to say what that is because that's giving away the plot. But that's a beautiful question because it really makes me think about it. And in figuring that out differently for each of the characters, it did help me try to understand each of those characters more deeply. Nancy?
I'm curious how, when you started writing this, since it was an offshoot of something else, did you have the whole story in your head and then write it, or did you kind of find it as you were writing it?
Yeah, good question. I did not have the whole story in my head. Basically, it's like I had like a propulsive idea, and I knew that it was like having a car with one tank of gas, right? I was like, okay, I'm gonna go as far as I can go before I have to refuel. And I knew as soon as I started writing, I had an idea that I wanted this to be the first scene. I rewrote it many, many times, but I knew what the first scene was. And then I knew we were gonna be immediately in Antonia's life as a 25-year-old running around doing what she was doing, and then she was gonna get called back by her uncle. And that's right from Antigone, right? But from there, that's why I took that 24-hour rule and said, what's gonna happen over 24 hours? Because then I would say, all right, we've got to get her to noon. And then I would say, okay, I know by the end of this section at noon, I want her to be in front of the library. But I would have no idea how she was gonna get there or what was gonna happen along the way. So that's when I put more gas in the car and kept driving. Val?
I love how you introduced this idea of the flypaper and how you kept going back to Bosnia. And I'm wondering, you've always been somebody who seems like just curious about so many things. Like, what is the next? Are you out there already thinking about something that you can commit this amount of time to next?
Yeah.
Want to give us a hint?
I'm working on two projects, two flypaper kinds of things, which is really fun. One of which is it's going to be a very different. I'm not a genre writer, so I'm not going to stay in the mystery genre, and I'm not even sure this is a mystery genre novel. It's much more. It's a family drama that's also a mystery. It's sort of zig and zag between the two of them. The next book. I've also, strangely enough, have kind of an ancient Greek influence to it, but it's completely fictional, so I'll leave it at that. But it's kind of got a more literary side to it. I guess I'm just completely bifurcating now. Instead of putting them both into one book, I'm doing two separate things because I'm also working on a thriller. That's just a straight up thriller, and that's with a co-author.
Very high capacity. High throughput. Yeah, that's awesome.
Hey.
I don't want you to reveal too much of the plot, but I just wondered can you tell us more about the uncle, Christopher King? I'm looking for some insights.
Yeah. So the adoptive uncle, Christopher King, who was sort of he was sort of the Creon character from Antigone, but here's what I learned as a writer, and then I can talk a little more about character. I learned as a writer that if you're going to use a villain from ancient Greece as your main villain on the page, it's really hard because they're really bad. And people just aren't that bad all the time. I needed more nuance, the first several drafts I was like, damn, he's too bad. It's just too much. He's yelling all the time. There's all these, you picture all these exclamation points, you picture sort of emails in all caps, and no, he can't be that person. So I had to nuance him, and to me, he ended up being somebody, though, even though I don't agree with what he did, or, I could see that he believed at that time in his reasons for doing it. And that I understood, and I still understand. I really understand people who deeply believe that they have a powerful, even a moral center, even if it's very different than my own, that they are doing something because they believe this is the right way to proceed. And for Christopher, over the course of time, it unraveled. He thought he had things under control. He thought he was doing things for his family. That's what drives him. That's what moves him. And that's, at the end of the day, where he feels like, to use the Facing History in Ourselves term, his universe of obligation is centered, is family.
I realized I was more worried for you. I'm like, was there someone like this in Anne's life?
Oh,
because I was thinking you write what you know.
Oh, I made it up. Oh, Megan, thank you for being so concerned. You're really kind. But, once again, back to that, when I had small children, they would die if I made people up like this kind of thing. It's fun to be able to be free into your imagination and just be like, that. I really have always had that desire to just say, yeah, I just want to go make things up. I like doing that. I just do.
I had another question about Facing History, and were you drawn, did the job change you, or were you drawn to it because you were interested? Tell me about that, because there's so many Facing History people, and I know someone who used to,
Jill Carp.
Jill Carp.
Yeah. I also do need to say, because we're talking about Facing History, you know, to say a moment about Margot Stern-Strom, who just passed away a week ago, who was the co-founder of Facing History and somebody that was massively influential in the lives of those of us who have been through that the Whirlwind program. And she was, you know, a Brookline giant and very important in her thinking and construction of, I don't want to go into it too much because I want to answer your question, but what Facing History was when I entered it was a 35-year-long program that had extended from a class in the Brookline school system where it was about looking differently at, you know, saying, what is the Holocaust and how can you actually look at it as a teacher and as a student in a way that you can, you know, learn about your own life and the traumas and the troubles that are going on around you and around the world, and have empathy and understanding, and how can difficult history be a case study to learn about human behavior, right? And 35 years in, it was pretty legendary, and I interviewed for a job here and met Margot and met Mark and met Brooke, and others who are in the audience came later. Patty and I started the same day. And what I have to say about that way of thinking, about the Facing History way of thinking, is when I sat down and interviewed for that job, I thought, I've just stepped into the dinner table conversations that I had around my own dinner table as a child. Because I grew up in the house with a dad who was a legal scholar and a constitutional law scholar and a family law scholar, and talked about ethics and values and the meaning of all of those things. And so I felt like, oh, well, this organization operates the way I was trained to think, and it is where I can express my beliefs and have a job and help make this go as far as I can help make it go. See? Exactly. Thank you, Margot.
Yeah. No, that's so interesting. I was wondering how that, I can see how the way you grew up was related.
Yeah, and then it complicated it even more, because Facing History is all about complicating it further. What about, and then have you thought about this? And then have you thought about this? And what about that? Anthony was an intern at Facing History when I was running the communications department. So, you know, we've got, you know, Mark, who was one of the people who hired me, and then Anthony was one of the people that I brought on, and Valerie came through Facing History and is now doing incredible things at the Kennedy Center Library. So a lot of people here doing a lot of great things.
Did you bring that and then into the writing of this book?
Yeah.
When you were,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the way to see history is inextricable now from Facing History, right? So thinking about the lives of these characters is completely bound up with reading first-person accounts of genocide and crimes against humanity survivors from all off, from Cambodian genocide, from the Holocaust, the Bosnian genocide, from the Armenian genocide, all of these first-person accounts that we worked with for teachers and for students, you know, over and over again. That is seared into the way that I think and feel. And then one of the things that I did after I left Facing History is I became a consultant for the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. I did consulting for the Center for the Prevention of Genocide for several years, and also for the Levine Institute, which does secondary school education. So I was able to actually deepen some of my research through those resources as well. But that's all because of Facing History. I, you know, never would have had the opportunity to do that if I hadn't come through this program. Yeah.
Any other questions? I think we're getting the wrap it up symbol.
We are. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Laura. Please read Small World. Read Small World. It's so great. Small World is so great.